Welcome to the latest edition of USC Trojans Prime Time Live here at the Voice of College Football. I'm Matt Zemek. He's Ethan Inman coming back at you. Preseason camp. And by the way, maybe I'm the annoying, nitpicky journalist or journalism major that you hate having around, but it's not fall camp. This is July 31st. We don't call it fall camp. We call it preseason camp because it's not the fall, all right? So preseason camp is underway at USC. Lots to talk about in that regard. But first, some news, fresh news, just happened not too long ago. We love fresh news to talk about on our show. Ethan Inman, Adrian Klemm joins Lincoln Riley's staff, and plot twist, I mean, the fact that he's joining is a plot twist, but a double plot twist, he's joining as a defensive analyst. He has experience as an offensive line coach. Lots to unpack here. So let's do this in two steps. First, just the reaction to Lincoln Riley grabbing him. Then we'll deal with the defensive analyst part of it later. But first, just the reaction to that.
Yeah, so I'll bring up an article here just so we have something to look at. Look, it's Trojans Wire. There you go. That's where Matt does a lot of his writing. Adrian Klemm, obviously very experienced. He's been, around college football a long time, been around the NFL a long time. Like you said, offensive line coach. Another guy, it feels like that Lincoln Riley's going out to kind of get to have NFL experience in the room, which he's done a lot of, Rob Ryan, Eric Henderson, lots of those kind of guys. Also for recruiting, he's known as a really good recruiter. So that side of things is kind of, I think, why this hire. It's really interesting timing. I mean, there's only really less than a month now until the season starts, and we're still adding people to the coaching staff. So, I mean, I think it's not necessarily like something to be worried about because USC has already had such a solid, kind of in-place coaching staff for, it's not like they're filling major holes. It feels like Adrian Klemm's just kind of an ad. But, and, it's never a bad thing to just add coaches that, you want to add as soon as possible so you can get that culture kind of instilled, which is something we'll talk about a little later in the show, I'm sure. But, yeah, I mean, defensive analyst, kind of a puzzling one there, given his experience on the offensive line. I'm sure, they're looking to have kind of a guy who can really instruct some of these guys on what to do in the trenches, and that may be part of it. I mean, maybe he is instructing some of the defensive linemen on how to attack the offensive line. Maybe that's, part of why they're bringing him on the defensive side of the ball, even though he's an offensive guy. I'd assume he's going to help a little bit on the offensive line as well. I know Lincoln Riley said he's going to have multiple roles, and, he's not a guy who's like super stuck to a title, I think is what I saw, something along those lines. But yeah, a lot of experience, a lot of, recruiting experience as well. And just another guy who, USC is trying to make this a very experienced, very NFL-like program. And they brought in a guy who's very experienced, has been to the NFL. So it seems to kind of follow that train. But what are your thoughts, Matt?
I mean, I am really struggling to wrap my head around this. And I'm not saying it's a bad move, but the timing of this move, obviously, like what can a coach provide this close to the season? The other piece of this is, like, your recruiting is rolling. So, I mean, the idea of bringing in Adrian Klemm as a defensive analyst. Now, see, here's the thing. If he was like an assistant offensive line coach, it would make so much more obvious sense, right? Because offensive line is where this program needs to start hitting home runs. And it's begun to do that a little bit as part of the recruiting surge, but it's mostly on the defensive side of the ball. So if Adrian Klemm was like helping out with offensive line recruiting, okay, sure, natural fit. I'm not sure just, what added personnel needs to be brought in terms of the defensive support staff. Danton Lynn, Eric Henderson, Rob Ryan, Doug Belk. Like, you have things pretty nailed down on defense. So that really does elicit some points of curiosity. And again, I'm not saying it's a bad hire. I'm just I'm just trying to figure out the logic of this on a number of levels. The main piece being he's a defensive analyst. The other part is like, what's in this for Adrian Klemm, right? Because and here's the background. I'm going to ask you about this, because this is part of peeling away the layers of the onion. Former UCLA assistant, former Oregon assistant, former NFL assistant. Okay, and he joins USC when the Trojans are not at the height of their powers. So just in terms of Adrian Klemm's career trajectory, what is in this for him? How does he see this as a catalyst for him and perhaps his career? And are we dealing even with a situation in which Adrian Klemm? I don't think he's been a coordinator. I think he's been pretty consistently a position coach. Is this like him trying to rebrand himself as maybe a possible defensive coordinator? And the idea that you can be a defensive coordinator after having offensive experience and offensive line experience in particular, it's not that ridiculous, because being a defensive coordinator means like you're reading the tendencies of offenses, and you're understanding the schemes of offensive lines. You're understanding blocking schemes, so a defensive coordinator could know how to counter that. But it's still a puzzler, right? That when he was with Dan Lanning, when the Oregon ship was rising, and now he joins USC. Man, that there's a lot to unpack here. So my question for you is, from USC's vantage point, not talking about Adrian Klemm's vantage point, because I just laid that out right now, but do you think this is an opposition intel hire? That this is about having a guy who has been inside the corridors in Westwood and in Eugene. USC does play Oregon. USC obviously, the sooner it can eclipse Oregon, the better. That it can cement an even greater advantage. I'd have to think that for all the weird aspects of this move, and let me be clear, weird does not mean bad. I'm just puzzled. I'm not disapproving. Those are two very different things. I'm just puzzled by a lot of the aspects of it. The thing that really does make the most sense, Ethan, and everyone watching here at the Voice of College Football, is the opposition intel angle. To talk to me more, Ethan, about hiring someone who has a history at both UCLA and especially Oregon.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think the opposition angle is a real angle, especially since he worked with Dan Lanning, and that's obviously the regime that's still in place over there at Oregon. It's the regime that they have to prepare for. I think, I talked a little bit earlier about how, he's working on the defensive side of the ball as a former offensive guy. So maybe he's like bringing like an offensive line minded approach to the defensive line, and like trying to, help them with how to attack the offensive line. And then, maybe it's kind of the same thing. Maybe it's like, well, I don't really know how things work here, but this is how things work there. So, here's how we can kind of counter that. Maybe, that's kind of his job, is all about countering. I do think he's an interesting kind of future stash. And I think that this kind of goes back to your question about what's in it for him, and maybe a little bit what's in it for USC as well. I think it's possible that, if USC has the kind of year defensively that we're hoping that they're going to have, this year and maybe next year, it's possible that a lot of these guys are going to be getting NFL offers. And, I'm sure, Rob Ryan loves his job. Danton Lynn obviously stuck around, even though he could have gone other places, right? Like there's a lot, all these guys are happy at USC, but at some point, if you're a linebackers coach at a college and you get an NFL offer, or you get, like an NFL coordinator offer, or you get like a college head coaching offer, like those start to get enticing. Maybe Adrian Klemm is a guy you kind of have stashed there, like experienced. And then when, Coach Henney takes off, you can put him in there, and, especially now that he's getting some experience on the defensive side of the ball. other defensive coaches, because like I said, I'm sure they're going to have some interest in their coaches. Maybe even if they move on from Josh Hansen, he takes on the offensive line. I don't know. But I do think he's the kind of guy who USC just kind of getting a head start on having him in their building may prove to be beneficial if some of the coaches get, offers to go elsewhere down the line. I think it's possible.
I think that's a good angle, that USC has high quality assistants who are in demand, and of course Matt Entz had a really good year and he got the head coaching job at Fresno State in 1 year, and USC and under Lincoln Riley wants to be known as a place where, hey, you join our staff, you're going to be a candidate for upward trajectory, upward mobility in the coaching ranks. So that part of this makes sense. Just want to nail something down about Adrian Klemm. It is correct. He has never been an offensive coordinator, or for that matter, any kind of coordinator. Now, he has been the run game coordinator, but that is essentially position game coach. But he's never been the lead offensive play caller for any of the teams that he's worked with, be it in the NFL or the college game. So yeah, upon reflection, the upward mobility in terms of Adrian Klemm, that this might be a way of just broadening his resume, and that is a parallel with Matt Entz. Matt Entz said that people told him, if you want to be a head coach, you need some Division I experience. That what you had at North Dakota State wasn't quite enough, so he needed to check that box on his resume, being a D1 assistant. He goes through that year. He does good work. We saw how good Eric Gentry was in that first month of the season before he got hurt. So Matt Entz then gets Fresno State, which, it's not just any old job. Like, that is one of the better group of 5 jobs. The history under Pat Hill, under Jeff Tedford, a guy named Kalen DeBoer was head coach at Fresno State. That is a good group of 5 job. So obviously Matt Entz going to USC's staff worked out for him. So Adrian Klemm, that might work out for him as well. In terms of, let's pursue this angle about being a defensive analyst, Ethan. If you're studying defensive schemes and you're trying to help the defense deal with offensive line play, so Klemm's understanding of offensive line play, like, there's a certain compatibility there. It's just, again, why don't you just put him on as like an assistant offensive line coach, or perhaps just an offensive analyst? Again, like that still is something I'm trying to wrap my head around. But like, I can see it, right? I can see the concept. You're a defensive analyst to combat offensive line play, offensive line schemes. My question for you, Ethan, is, do you think there's actually going to be a lot of interplay for Adrian Klemm between helping the defense and helping the USC offense? Maybe it's just that, well, you have to pick a title, right? Like, you can't just be analyst, right? I haven't heard of a program hire an analyst. It's either an offensive analyst or a defensive analyst. I'm not sure if I've ever heard of a special teams analyst, but like, you have to pick a silo. But maybe that's irrelevant, or maybe that should be minimized in all of this. Maybe that's just a technicality, and Adrian Klemm's going to be helping the defense, but also the offensive line. And he's going to be in both rooms, and he's going to be providing input both ways. I mean, there's no way for us to conclusively know exactly how his role will unfold, Ethan. But if you had to guess right now at this preliminary stage, do you think Adrian Klemm's going to primarily be in that defensive room, or do you think he's going to be an equal opportunity analyst on both sides of the ball at USC?
I think he is going to primarily work in the defensive room, just because that is the title they gave him. I mean, if they were planning on splitting him evenly, like, they had to come to a decision. They obviously came to the decision that he was going to be called a defensive analyst in title. So I would assume that, that's where they plan to use him the most. But I think, based on, what I've heard and what I've read so far about him and what USC wants to do with him, I do think he will work with the offensive line in some capacity and with the offense in general. it sounds like his role is pretty flexible, and I'm sure too he's going to be figuring it out, and Lincoln Riley's going to be figuring it out a little bit as the season progresses, as they figure out his personality and how he works with the players and all those kinds of things. So both sides of the ball for sure, but I would assume, like, just because that's what they're saying he's going to do, that he'll be primarily defense.
All right, one more question on Adrian Klemm before we move along to other topics here at the Voice of College Football. You mentioned earlier, and again, I think this is a highly salient point on your part. I could say that's just a redundancy because you always make salient points, Ethan. But this particularly salient point is that that Adrian Klemm is being brought on board in case there's a staff vacancy this upcoming offseason. And again, you want vacancies in the sense that you want to be seen as a program where you do such a good job internally that your stock as a coach, getting a plum job, rising up the food chain, you want to be known as a program that produces upwardly mobile coaches. So my specific question, though, is, even though he's a defensive analyst, do you think that this is also a move that is at least something of a challenge, an internal message to offensive line coach Zach Hanson, that, hey, you're on board this season. We're giving you the keys to this weighty position of offensive line coach, but if you don't measure up, we have someone else in the building who we can fill your slot with next year. How much do you think the Zach Hanson angle is a part of the calculus at USC? Obviously, it's an entirely speculative question. I just want to get your feel for that.
I think it's very possible that Zach Hanson is under the consideration when they're adding Adrian Klemm to the kind of staff. I don't know if it is so in the sense that they want to put pressure on him. Maybe they are. I don't know. I don't think they're going to explicitly say so if they are, but I do think, like, regardless, Adrian Klemm benefits Zach Hanson because he either, but depending on what his role is, if he's adversarial, if it's like competitive, if he's kind of, keeping Zach Hanson on his toes just in case, his performance is not satisfying, they obviously have an internal guy who they can kind of slide into that role if it doesn't work out. Or the other way around, where, Adrian Klemm's a guy who's experienced. I'm sure, Zach Hanson could benefit from like a little iron sharpening iron situation where he just kind of, tells stories and teaches him about, kind of the things that he's seen in the NFL and seen in all these different programs. Like, anytime you can bring in a guy who's experienced, that's going to help a guy who's trying to establish himself in a program like Zach Hanson is at USC. So I think either way, it's beneficial for Zach Hanson, and I'm sure it's done with him in mind. I just want to read, I found a quote more directly about what Lincoln Riley said about Adrian Klemm's role. And because I was referencing, how they were going to use him, but I didn't have a specific source. I went and found one. On the USC Athletics YouTube channel, he said, Adrian was available and was a position that we had talked about. We've had a position in the past that's going to work with our defense, but more of an offense coach background. We were actively looking for somebody in that role. It's a little bit tough to find sometimes, but it was just one of those things where Adrian was available and obviously had some familiarity with this place and some people on our staff. We got a chance to connect with him and it just made sense. So he'll work primarily with our defensive staff, but we're certainly going to use him in a few other areas as well.
So there you go. Like there a measure of offensive involvement. The door is open to that. So that does reinforce some of the things that we've been discussing. So a very fascinating move. And as we segue to our next topic, let's just say, first of all, our next topic is going to be Trumain Carroll. Clear parallel between Adrian Klemm and Trumain Carroll in that they were hired well into the off season. And of course, in Klemm's case, right before training camp, right before preseason camp, but not hired in December, not hired in January, not hired in February, Trumain Carroll after spring and Adrian Klemm right before preseason camp. So there's a clear parallel between those two hires. So the timing is not something that USC really has cared about in those two instances. And that also suggests to me, like, this is part of playing the long game for 2026, for 2027, laying the groundwork and getting what USC thinks is top tier personnel for these upcoming years when you have the Whole Foods groceries, the elite groceries, the top end players. Like, make sure you're not going to be squandering high end talent and you get expert voices in the building. So what are we talking about with Trumain Carroll as we pivot from Adrian Klemm? Well, Ethan, Trumain Carroll had a lot to say, and I'm rubbing my hands on this one because everyone who has watched the USC show here at the Voice of College Football, whether it was me with Tim Prangley or now this year, everyone knows I was against Benny Wiley. I wanted Benny Wiley out of here. And USC tossed him, so that's great. And so, I'm excited about what Trumain Carroll, Coach Carroll at USC, it just feels right. I'm excited about what Trumain Carroll is bringing to the table. He's talking a little bit about what's new, the new regime. Ethan Inman, lay it out for everyone watching here at the Voice of College Football.
Yeah, for sure. I'll kind of just share some tweets that I saw about Trumain Carroll. This one's really interesting. The first day Trumain Carroll took over as USC strength and conditioning coach, the team was supposed to run half gassers, but he didn't like their warm-up. So they never made it to the official workout for the simple reason that how you do one thing is how you do everything. So basically in this situation, Trumain Carroll, they were warming up and he didn't like it. So they basically spent the time, around, I think it was around an hour that they're going to be running half gassers to teach them how to warm up correctly. Like, he's really setting the foundation, at even, the most kind of, even the most foundational parts of this program and how he wants it to run. Another one, he set the policy that the team has to earn the right to run the stairs inside the Coliseum over the summer. It's such a sacred place. I didn't want to disrespect it by coming in before we were ready. He explained, again, similar idea. He's, not really taking anything for granted here, not really taking any details for granted at all. He wants, to see a certain level of performance out of USC in their workouts before he lets them run the stairs of the Coliseum, which you would think running the stairs of the Coliseum, that actually sounds pretty difficult and not something that players would look forward to. But now he's made it an incentive. That's how, kind of on top of it, he's been there. Then some Lincoln Riley comments on Trumain Carroll. He said he's really impressed with the conditioning level of his team coming out of the summer. He noted the improved discipline within the team and credited Trumain Carroll for the improvement in both of those areas. And then finally, there was one more a little bit further down here. I believe it was from Keeley. Yep. USC gained 800 pounds of muscle and lost more than 550 pounds of fat from January to July per Trumain Carroll. The foundation that was laid before I got here was a great foundation. I'm here to help enhance it and take it to another level, he said on Wednesday. So just a lot of different stuff that he said here. I don't know, seems like a really detail-oriented guy, which I really like. He's, setting the culture from day one. Like, we've obviously talked a lot about how 2026 is key. You can't really blame him if things don't go super swimmingly this year just because he's, on a bit of a shorter clock than normal. But he's not wasting any time. He's getting in there in 2025. He's setting the stage. He's, instilling kind of a culture from day one. He wants them to work really hard. He wants them to earn everything. He wants every single detail to be as, up to standard as possible, loving all of that. And then, just obviously some other notes here and there about where USC's at physically and stuff like that. But Matt, what's your thoughts on kind of all this from Trumain Carroll?
He's a man with a plan. It's pretty clear that he has a very well mapped out idea of what to do and what to achieve. And, keeping in mind that he hasn't had all that much time on the job. I mean, he speaks with an authoritativeness that indicates he knows exactly what he wants in terms of culture. So it hasn't been a massive uphill struggle for him to communicate the basic messages and core principles to his players that he wants to. I see a very impressive leader, and Benny Wiley, toss aside the mediocre results, like I never got the sense that he was similarly authoritative in creating a culture. And a lot of people chafed at the notion that Benny Wiley was this finesse coach. He advocated yoga, for athletes, but there was never the sense that like he was really driving the ship in terms of setting the highest possible standard for USC's program, because he was always one of Lincoln Riley's boys from Oklahoma, and that the two were joined at the hip. And I think the thing we need to remind ourselves of with Trumain Carroll, this is not one of Lincoln's guys. And it's part of the reality at USC, the necessary reality of, Lincoln, you have to give up your boys. You have to go outside your family, your inner circle, and bring on the best. Because, with Alex Grinch was obviously another classic case of this, that one of Lincoln's boys, Lincoln being loyal to his guys, held back USC. So this is that outside hire. It's part of the influence of Chad Bowden as well, that, Lincoln Riley is giving up some responsibilities and other people are making decisions. It's not nearly as exclusively Lincoln Riley's show. And I think that can only benefit USC. So I think that Lincoln Riley giving up something as part of his weakened state, and that'll happen when you have two disappointing seasons in a row. Then that leads to Trumain Carroll, who I think is taking hold of this job in ways that Benny Wiley never did. Other aspects of what Trumain Carroll said, and other aspects of what he's doing that you're looking at, Ethan Inman.
I think, just another brief note, I think it's kind of interesting and cool. Like you talked about him as like a very authoritative leader. I think it's really kind of cool to see him and Chad Bowden both are just so well spoken and like like you said, they have a plan, and they also just seem to be very passionate about and that comes through very, very easily. Obviously, like it doesn't seem forced, it doesn't seem difficult, it doesn't seem inauthentic. They just love football, and they love leading these young men into being the best they can be, and they want to win, and they're sparing no detail too. They seem very detail obsessed, and you could call both of them obsessed with football, I suppose. So they seem very personality aligned, which I think is really interesting. I also think that I think if you're Trumain Carroll, it's almost a bit of a risk what he did day one, in terms of like you're trying to set your relationship with your players, especially in this age of college football, where you're really it feels like a lot of coaches are really just tiptoeing around their players, trying not to scare them off into the transfer portal the next year. It's so much harder to retain players now than it's ever been before, when it was more difficult to transfer and there was less NIL involved and all that kind of stuff. And just in the era we grew up in too, like some players don't respond as well to such like a disciplined and kind of hard-nosed coach as Trumain Carroll seems to be, but he wasn't afraid of that. And I think part of that is, he saw that it worked at Kansas. At Kansas State. USC is a different program than Kansas State is, obviously, but he saw that it worked there. I think it's also partially that's the kind of players that he wants around. He wants the players that are going to respond to that kind of discipline and that kind of like going hard on the players, but for their benefit. And so I think that's all good signs as well. I think if you're a USC fan, that's the kind of players you want to stick around anyway. You want players that are willing to work hard and willing to take constructive criticism and all of those things, and willing to really work on the details, if even if those details are really excruciating and seemingly simple, like going back to working on the first day, like coming in and immediately being like, none of you warm up right, we're going to work on this for the time that we were supposed to be doing other stuff. No, we're going to work on warming up right, because this is, the foundation for everything. You come out here and you warm up before you do anything. So we're going to get that right before we do anything else. So I just think all of that's really encouraging, and it'll be interesting to see. It seems like the players are responding well so far. I mean, Lincoln Riley pointed out that he feels the team's more disciplined and he feels the team's more, just doing better on the strength and conditioning side of things. So I think, the players seem to be responding well so far. I think the players that you're going to see really separate themselves this year and having roles next year in 2026 too are going to be the guys that really respond well and, work well with Trumain Carroll and kind of get into the shape that Trumain Carroll wants them to be in. So I think that'll be something kind of interesting to analyze and kind of another layer of the onion, as you like to say, Matt, in terms of when we're looking at next year, like who are, and, just as the season goes on, like who are those players that are separating themselves and have really established a role on this team, maybe even if players transfer out at the end of the season, like this could be a potential reason why, but obviously that's not a knock on Trumain Carroll. That's more a knock on them, I would think, but just kind of another interesting layer to the onion, I think. But yeah, I really like a lot of what he's doing and like a lot of what he's saying, and looking forward to seeing how that kind of affects the team.
There's the quote that you have screenshotted in which people can see, about, not disrespecting the Coliseum by coming in before we were ready. That particular quote impresses me in a very specific way. It's a message that says, like, we haven't achieved anything until, like, we prove it. That kind of the basic message there. I mean, you could kind of twist it in a few different ways, but like that's one very legitimate and I think relatively clear interpretation. Let's not say we're ready until like we really are ready. So like don't get too ahead of yourself. And this is a real contrast to a guy that we all know very well at USC, a guy named Clay Helton. A guy who would do a lot of sunshine pumping. It's going to be great, and optimism. And like, I don't want coaches really talking very optimistically before this season, especially at a program where, you've had 2 straight mediocre seasons. I don't want coaches spending the summer telling us how great things are going to be. I want coaches to do their bleepity bleeping jobs and get this program rocking and rolling. And then after you've achieved something, okay, like then you can hand out all the praise you want because you've actually earned it, past tense. You've done something. Like that's what I want to see. And so Trumain Carroll is really in that vein. Like he doesn't think this group has achieved anything. That's not a criticism. It's just the step in the process, the place in the evolutionary arc. USC just hasn't done anything yet, not this team, okay? And that gets to something really important. It's that, of course, we all want to see this team and this program succeed. Every fan base, any team wants to see, the whole operation succeed. But that doesn't mean that, in terms of, we're basically a month before the season, offering a pessimistic forecast doesn't mean that you don't want the program to be good. You just don't think it's going to happen. And it's kind of, I'll believe it when I see it. And that maybe that makes a person a doubting Thomas, but like there's a real and important truth there. We need to actually see in concrete, living color and fleshed, embodied, what progress, what success looks like before we say USC's arrived. USC's going to be a 10-2 team. USC's going to make the college football playoff. And I'm not even saying that I don't think this team's going to do well. I think I'm at 9-3, which is not terrible, but it's not the ideal. So I don't I'm not thinking this team's going to be 7-5 or 8-4. I am not quite sold on this team being 10-2 and being a playoff team. So there's a certain degree of skepticism, but just on a broader intellectual level, like I'm sick and tired of forecasts. Like we need to see concrete proof that things have really changed. This is why, and I don't think, for instance, that Zach Hansen's going to struggle as offensive line coach. I'm actually pretty agnostic. on Zach Hanson as offensive line coach. I don't know what to expect from him. Like, I knew that Josh Henson needed to go. Like, I was pretty solid on that. Zach Hanson, I don't have a strong opinion in terms of predicting what he will do or what's going to happen. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, for the sake of a hypothetical, that I was skeptical of Zach Hanson. It doesn't mean that I don't want Zach Hanson to succeed. And one could draw the parallel to, like, I wanted Benny Wiley to succeed, even though I was banging the drum saying, I thought he needed to go. Like, there are different lanes, there are different silos that we work in as fans, and for Ethan, you and me as public commentators. You can have a skeptical view of a public figure, of an athlete, of a coach, but that doesn't mean you wish that public figure to fail. Like, you think I care more about being right than seeing USC succeed? At Trojans Wire, I make money if USC is great, all right? I get more page views, I get more dollars. Like, I write a 10-item listicle, it's going to be seen by several tens of thousands more people if USC is a 12-1 team compared to if USC is an 8-4 team. So, like, I definitely want USC to be great. But of course, what I want and what I think and what I predict, like, what I think and what I predict, those are even like two separate things. Like, a prediction, is worth a warm bucket of spit. Like, who cares whether someone has this prediction or not? But in terms of what a person even thinks, like, I'm skeptical about this coach, I'm worried about this player. That's just a process of bringing up certain tension points, certain conversation points, certain elements of uncertainty which have yet to be resolved. And so I really, after what we've been through together the last 2 years at USC, I love Trumain Carroll talking about, don't want to do anything, don't want to say anything until we're ready. Like, don't want to puff out our chests or do things until, like, we've actually done something, we've actually made, past tense, real progress. Like, I love that, and it's exactly the opposite of how Clay Helton handled its business. So, if anyone kind of feels annoyed or a little turned off by this little filibuster, I just want to say, like, I hope this clarifies points that fans often confuse from commentators, especially at a sensitive time such as 1 month before the start of a very important, very intriguing season at USC. That what you want and what you think and what you predict, they're all three very, very, very different things. And so how we view public figures at a certain point in time, it doesn't mean like that's kind of the final verdict or the final judgment. It's more of, does reality reflect that a coach has met, past tense, a certain standard, that the program has met, past tense, a certain level of achievement? And this all is connected to Trumain Carroll saying, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's not get ahead of our skis here at USC. We achieve things, we do things, we accomplish things, then we get to puff our chests. Then we get to say that we've done something. I just think that's a very helpful message, Ethan Inman, before we go into a new college football season.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I think, I, for one, am an optimist. I love optimism. I love cheering for, the players and the coaches on my team until the bitter end. Like, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think, as someone who is following the MLB trade deadline very closely, this is, something that comes into focus a lot during this time of year, is like, there are teams that have to decide whether, they realistically think that they can compete for a World Series that year, or if they're, if the more realistic option would be to sell and trade for some prospects and kind of reload for the next year. And it's always really fascinating what teams decide to do. There's always a team that you think is going to sell that ends up buying, and there's always a team that you think is going to buy that ends up selling. And it's just like, I think of the Mets a couple of years ago as a great example of a team that everyone was like, oh, they look like they're competing, and then they're like, we're looking to compete next year, and people were like, what? Like, that kind of totally came out of the blue. But anyways, I think that's something that I think about a lot, and it's always just, you see players traded, and it's always such mixed emotions, because it's like, oh, like, that's a guy that I really liked, and I was really rooting for him to do the best, but at the same time, like, I see where the team is going, and I see why this is best for the organization. Sometimes you don't see either one, but if it is possible to be like, oh, I was really rooting for that guy in this situation, and I'm really bummed that he had to be kind of let go, or I was really rooting for this team and I'm bummed that they're having to sell, but I understand why it's the best. So yeah, totally get that, to back up your point there. I think it's possible to do a bit of both. It's possible to be in Trumain Carroll's situation and be like, hey, we want to be a team that is in the college football playoff this year. We think I'm going to work my very hardest to be the kind of strength and conditioning coach that prepares the team to do that. But still being honest, like, still coming in and saying, hey, day one, like, the way that the players stretched was not up to my standard. Like, that's, not necessarily the, like, oh, I came into the, most rousing review of the USC football program. It's not like, oh, I came into USC and just everything was rocking and rolling already, and I'm just like, our players are the best, and I'm like, I'm just basically like along for the ride, basically, because everything is going so well. Like, it's not, it's a bit of an indictment on where USC's discipline was, where their strength and conditioning was at that point. He's being honest there. But he's also, so it's possible to do both. And I think that that's what we're going to see from him. Because like I said, he seems like a guy who really wants to win, really cares about this program, this heritage. I mean, he pointed out, like, the Coliseum is something that he reveres. So it's possible to do both. And he seems like a guy who understands that balance for sure.
All right, folks. So a lot of discussion about Trumain Carroll specifically. This sets up our discussion for a look at the roster and some of the measurables, some of the weights and heights and things like that. More on that with Ethan Inman on the other side of this commercial announcement. So 45 seconds for this commercial from our sponsor. We'll see you on the other side with some roster talk heading into preseason camp.
You can make a difference here at the Voice of College Football. Use the Amazon link. Financially contribute to the Voice of College Football without spending a penny. Same shopping experience. It's easy. Go to any video on any channel. Go to the description section and grab the link right next to the capital letters that say Amazon. Use that link, and Amazon will instantaneously convert to your account, settings, history, everything intact, just like whatever link you use right now. No difference. Pay no attention to the product that you see right there. Just go search what you want. Don't forget the Amazon link. Thank you for your support. Sincerely, the Voice of College Football.
All right, Ethan. So on the other side of our discussion about Trumain Carroll, USC last week released some weights and heights and all sorts of numbers and facts and figures. So let's dig into just some of the things that you saw with that initial release, and the physical profiles. Obviously, we've talked a lot about culture and mindset, professional attitude, professional approach, those kinds of things. But now we get into measurables, some more tangible things. So of all the things that you've digested over the past several days, what are the things that stand out the most to you as you look at this, get this first glance at the 2025 USC football roster?
Yeah, for sure. Let me go ahead and pull up another article. I think it's another Trojans Wire article. Trojans Wire is on fire today, Matt. But so some notable weight changes since spring practice on USC's roster. It's a lot of offensive line guys. You've got Aaron Dunn, who gained 25 pounds over the summer. You've got Hayden Trader, another offensive lineman, who's up 15 pounds. Walter Matthews, who's a tight end, not an offensive lineman, but we'll probably see a lot in blocking, up to 285 from 272. Another offensive lineman, Elijah Vacona, Alani Noah, another offensive lineman who's projected to be kind of a starter and a guy who has a big role, up 20 pounds. Prince Strahan, I'm going to skip for now because I'm going to come back to him. Alex Payne, similarly, gained 40 pounds, is up to 305 from 265 when he first signed. So that's a huge difference there. Shout out to Alex, obviously. That's a huge accomplishment for him. So, all of the ones that this article points out, and I think very kind of astutely, a lot of offensive linemen there. I do want to highlight Prince Strahan specifically just for a second, just because I think him putting on 11 pounds is really interesting. He's obviously a guy who is, USC is kind of trying to figure out who is going to be, I'm sure, the third wide receiver behind Jacoby Lane and Mekhi Lemon. Obviously, Lake McCree is probably going to get a lot more action this year than in years past at tight end as well. But, there's not really a clear number 3 guy at wide receiver. And I'm sure that's going to kind of work itself out in battles in camp. But for Prince Strahan, like putting on 11 pounds to a frame that's already, 6 feet 5 inches tall, I'm sure that's going to benefit him quite a bit. Just looking at his stats at Boise State, not a lot of production, only had 37 catches in 2 years, but was really good at, the longer plays, had over 15 yards a catch. So he's a big target that's become an even bigger target. He's a guy you could find, I'm sure, in downfield plays and, putting on some strength. Maybe he breaks some more tackles. Maybe, he's even more physically imposing for those, defensive backs to try to cover. So I think that's going to become a real advantage for him in particular. And it is a notable storyline, I think, because he's, like I said, a guy who was at a program last year that was a college football playoff program in Boise State. Should be, competitive for some real meaningful time at wide receiver. So, lots of offensive line, and then Prince Strahan really astutely pointed out storylines there. Curious on your thoughts, though, Matt.
Well, to me, when you see all those weight gains on the offensive line, to me, that means one thing, and that is the thing that almost every USC fan wants to see: run the dang ball. Student body right. Let's mash some people. Let's lean on some people, and let's just be physical and nasty and rugged in ways that, USC offensive lines haven't generally been. And obviously, with Jaden Maiava, a running quarterback, as your signal caller, there will be some read option plays. There will be some finesse plays in the package, but being able to mash the ball between the tackles and being able to run the ball with your setbacks on carries or pitches, that's going to make Jaden Maiava's life a lot easier. Now, obviously, it'll set up the downfield passing game for USC if the Trojans can be really consistent. And this is a point that we've made before, but it's worth making it again, that USC's average yards per carry last year was around 5, which looks really, really good on paper. But that 5-yard average, more or less, was gain 10, gain 0, gain 9, gain 1. It's not as though USC was getting 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, 5, 5, 6, 4. It was like a 9-yard run and then 1 or 0, and an 11-yard run and then a -1. Obviously, I agree. Let's be very clear here. Lincoln Riley does need to continue to work the run game. He can't always be throwing the ball on 2nd and 9 just because he got stuffed on 1st and 10. He needs to stick with the run game a little bit more than he did last season. And the thing that you, Ethan, have really drilled deep on was, run the ball on 2nd and goal from the 5. You get stuffed on first down inside the 10. You need to be able to go back to the running game instead of throwing a bleepity bleep and fade pass on 2nd and goal from the 5. So obviously, just very clear, Ethan and I are both on the record as saying, yes, Lincoln needs to trust that run game a little more. You can't always abandon it. Obviously, on 2nd and 9, that's generally a passing down, but there needs to be a few more occasions where USC is willing to run the ball on consecutive snaps so that defenses can't get that firm expectation that, oh, it's 2nd and 9, a pass is coming. You can't be that predictable. You do have to mix things up. And there's the other point that, the screen game or the short passing game, like a quick hitch, technically it's a pass, but essentially it's a run. It's an extended handoff. So in other words, on 2nd and 9, if you're throwing a screen or a quick hitch, that shouldn't necessarily be interpreted as abandoning the running game, because again, that's an extended handoff. It's more of 2nd and 9, let's do 7-step drop and let's search well down the field and nothing's there, incomplete pass. That would be abandoning the run game. But anyway, Ethan, like these increased weights tell me that USC really does want to lean on people. We've talked about it so often in this very long off season, which is thankfully about to end. We get to see a new season, but Lincoln Riley did not trust his offensive line to get the tough yard, to grind things out, 3rd and short, 4th and short. He bailed, and he shouldn't have. But I understand why he did it. That it was not where USC was getting 5 yards every carry. The average was 5, but it's not as though 5 yards was the representative gain on every carry. To me, Ethan, it seems as though that's really the main story to take away from all these weight gains up front.
Yeah, I think something else that's really interesting to kind of note here about a lot of these offensive linemen is a lot of them are young guys. Like Aaron Dunn is a freshman early enrollee. Hayden Trader's a redshirt freshman. Walter Matthews is a younger guy, true freshman. Alani Noah is obviously a junior. He's like the biggest name on this list outside of Prince Trahan, I would say. Probably even a bigger name than Prince Trahan in terms of his expected commitment to the USC football team this year. And then Alex Payne, true freshman. I think what you're seeing too is a lot of guys who really took it upon themselves to not take any days off over the summer and, put their best foot forward in terms of getting themselves physically ready for the season, because they're as aware as anybody that this 2026 recruiting class is coming and that, jobs are really going to be at a premium when, all these really super talented 4 and 5 stars come in. And if you're, a freshman ahead of this 2026 recruiting class, that gives you 1 year to really establish yourself before, these guys that come in that are super talented. So I think it's probably a lot of them that just saw who was coming and, probably also heard from Trumain Carroll a little bit and what his expectations were and said, shoot, like I got to really put my best foot forward and put 110% into these next couple of months ahead of the season. And not to say that they weren't going to do that already, but, maybe it's perhaps a little bit extra motivation having those guys behind you and having, Trumain Carroll coming in and just the situation being like, this year is really big to my entire career at USC. I have an opportunity now to fight for meaningful downs and meaningful plays, because it's not as deep of a team as it's going to be next year. But, next year the team gets deeper and, snaps at practice become a little bit more of a premium. So if I make an impression on this coaching staff, then I can, really put myself a leg up on some of these more talented kids that have a lot of talent, obviously, but don't, have the established kind of repertoire with the coaching staff. So I think that's probably, an unseen between the line storyline about all this, because it's so many young guys. So, and obviously, part of that's just, it's their first year in college. You have, it's a big shift between high school and college. The way that you approach things becomes rapidly quickly. But I do think that the situation that USC is in as a program right now is definitely informing that change as well.
Let's now take this larger theme of, a lot more beef up front for USC and apply it not just to the running game, but, we've talked about this in a certain framework over the offseason, but now let's apply it to the first few games on USC's schedule. So Missouri State, Georgia Southern, Purdue, right out of the chute. To me, I think when people refer to, oh, we need to try some things on offense, need to try some things with our personnel, that often gets interpreted reasonably, I might add, reasonably, as a quarterback thing. We need to see what kind of plays work for this quarterback. Need to see what kinds of passes, what kinds of play designs are comfortable for him. That's a reasonable thing. I'm not knocking it. I'm not criticizing it. But maybe with all these weight gains for offensive linemen, maybe this year with this early soft ramp up in the first 3 weeks of the schedule, maybe this idea of test driving the offense is less about seeing what works for Jaden Maiava and more what works for this offensive line. That maybe that might be the better framework to go about this. Like, if this offensive line can't mash against Missouri State, Georgia Southern, and Purdue, right? And so, like, you need these first 3 games not to establish Jaden Maiava's confidence. You need these first 3 games to establish the offensive line's confidence. And then if you do that, when you go into the Big Ten schedule, Michigan State and especially Illinois, then you'll have that offensive line clicking and trusting each other and knowing exactly what to do. And then the hope would be, conceptually, that will then feed into Jaden Maiava not only getting better protection, but being able to process plays, make reads with a comfort zone, which will lead to elite performance. So that's my question for you, Ethan. The first 3 games, is it more about establishing Jaden Maiava's confidence or about establishing the offensive line's confidence? And before I hand it over to you for your answer, obviously the two go hand in hand. Obviously the 2 projects run together. But in terms of like an emphasis, it's so easy for us to think about, well, Lincoln Riley needs Jaden Maiava confident. Yeah, of course he does. There's like, none of this implies that's not a huge and central need. Of course it is. But in terms of what the primary point of emphasis is in these first 3 games USC is going to be expected to win easily. Like, there is something to the idea of, as a coaching staff, well, A is a bigger priority than B. And that's what I'm asking. Is the offensive line's confidence more of a priority than Jaden Maiava's confidence? They both matter a ton. They're both central to the season. But if you had to pick one over the other, which one would it be?
I think I would pick the offensive line. And I think that's because I think Lincoln Riley has realized this offseason and has said as much that the trenches matter so much more in the Big Ten than they did in the Pac-12. And so I think that is probably going to be the emphasis. And also, I just think, you're looking at a situation at USC where, you want Hassan Longstreet to be the starter for this team at some point. You're kind of still figuring out what your running back room is going to look like, but you have a lot of talented running backs in there. Like, it's not like, Lincoln Riley, even, love Jaden Maiava, want him to do the best, but it's not like he has a Caleb Williams on his hands, right? So I think he's not delusional about, like, we have a guy in Maiava that can be, the kind of guy who can make up for all of these different other weaknesses that we have on the offense. I think that, in the Big Ten, you need to control the trenches to win football games. And I think that that's going to be the emphasis, just based on, what they've said there and just kind of the truth of playing in the Big Ten. Like you said, obviously Maiava's confidence, kind of plays hand in hand with that. But I just think too, like, after the way last season went in terms of losing games you're supposed to win, I think and I hope that a lot of the first few games you'll see more conservative football. And I don't mean that in the sense that, like, oh, USC is going to, like, be scared to play Missouri State. Not in any way at all. But I just think that you're going to see them not taking any of these opponents for granted, not like running flea flickers in the first quarter. Like, you're going to see, I would at least hope that you're going to see running the ball, taking this seriously, treating this game like as seriously as you're going to treat the the Michigan and the Oregon and the Notre Dame games later in the year, like you can't take any down for granted in the Big Ten, even when it is these early games, because we saw, USC go into Maryland, who didn't win any other Big Ten games last year, and lose that game somehow. So I just think they're, not going to, like I said, they're just not going to let any moment slip. And so I see, their identity in those games not being any looser. Now, you get to the fourth quarter and you're up by, 30 or 40 points, you can start trying stuff. But I think in the first few quarters, you're going to try to treat it like the first quarter of the Oregon game, where you're going to establish the trenches, run the football, and then, you get a couple touchdowns up, then you can start, building on my obvious confidence. But I think the first priority and the thing that you will see first in the games, at least I hope it would be what I would do, is establish the run, which you need to establish the offensive line to be able to do, obviously. So.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, that running the ball, which, is generally referred to as being conservative. And obviously we all understand that concept, that running the ball is the conservative play, passing the ball is the aggressive play. But, if you can dominate with the run game, there's nothing really conservative about running the ball. You're just pressing the advantage. You're emphasizing your strength. The other point we have to remind everyone about in terms of running the ball, especially in the context of an early season game, is if you're running the ball, you're shortening the game, which means less of a chance for injury. And, remember, with the college football playoff, teams now have to play 16, 17, potentially 17 games to win the national championship. So because the quest for a national title is now so much longer than it was just 2 years ago, you have to marshal your energies over the course of the full season. You can't be going great guns in every game. So these cupcake games, while of course you want backups to get meaningful snaps, first priority, your starters don't get hurt. Your starters don't get overextended, jeopardized. So that is the other very concrete benefit of running the ball, that you're shortening the game. You have fewer plays in these early season games, so that when you get into that gauntlet, Illinois, Michigan, Notre Dame, you're fresh. Your guys haven't played any more plays than absolutely necessary. They have a lot in the tank. You want your players to not be susceptible to injury. Obviously, it's not something you can guarantee, but you can certainly improve the odds by managing snap counts early in the season. That is why you play cupcake games, is that you have the breather. You're not required to dig fully deep for that win. Like, that's why Alabama plays the Citadel. We laugh at it. It's the coward's way, but there's a reason why that's done. There's a reason why Nick Saban is sitting on that pile of national championships in Tuscaloosa. Like, there's a reason why he did that. It's not just by accident. So using these early season games to run the ball, it also can shorten games and make sure that this team is really fresh for that mid-season stretch, Illinois, Michigan, Notre Dame, the stretch that is going to decide significantly what this season looks like for USC. All right, Ethan, any other final thoughts before we go?
Not that I can think of, Matt. I think we kind of covered it all for this week.
All right. Just one housekeeping note. We're going to be here on Thursdays at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. out in Los Angeles for the next few weeks. But we do want to tell you, when we get into the regular season, we are going to be moving this show to Tuesday. It's going to be more convenient. We recognize that, on Thursday nights during football season, there's an NFL game. There are also some college football games. So we're going to be moving this show off of Thursday once the season begins. But for the next few weeks, at least the next 2, maybe the next 3, we're still going to be here on Thursdays. But we're just wanting to give you advance notice about a change to Tuesday once we get into the college football regular season. So that's just one housekeeping note to keep track of here at the Voice of College Football. Make sure to like the show, subscribe to the USC channel, get the notification reminders, share these videos with friends, and also to watch the other team shows at the VOCFB. Also, our website, vocfb.com, which is mostly links to various team shows, but there's some original writing, and that's going to ramp up with the arrival of the season. We have some new writers that are going to be coming aboard in August for their insights on Notre Dame and other national programs. There's going to be like some Notre Dame Miami previews that you might be interested in. That's at our website, vocfb.com. And of course, Mark Rogers has his national college football show Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific. You can watch that show either live or just catch it on YouTube. So much football content for you to enjoy here at the Voice of College Football. So for Ethan Inman, this is Matt Zemek. Thanks for joining us for another week of USC Trojans Primetime Live. We will see you next Thursday at the regular time. So have a great week. Lots more on USC preseason camp. We'll see you next time.